Well, last night I finished the Final Fantasy VII Remake, and I wanted to come on and talk about it, kind of give you my impressions, my review of the game. I'll try to keep it, I'm not going to say spoiler free, but there will be some mild spoilers insofar as I'll kind of talk about the progression of the game, but I won't reveal too many of the in-depth story points. And, this was a game that I wasn't sure I was going to pick up. I had a kind of a negative opinion of it, just sort of reading about all the delays. And, I have my problems with a lot of modern AAA games. I think in many cases they are disappointments. And then I played the demo, and I didn't dislike the demo. I think a lot of modern Final Fantasy games, at least for me, have not really been that engaging. I think they feel kind of bloated, they feel very tedious, and the aesthetic, particularly in Final Fantasy 15, just turned me off to the point that I couldn't play it for more than 10 hours or so. I felt there was something plodding and just generally bland about it, and the longer I played, the more bored I got. So, with all of that, I kind of was like, probably not going to like Final Fantasy VII. But that demo felt fresh. It kind of hit a lot of the nostalgic points for somebody who grew up with Final Fantasy VII, and who, I've always said for me it was, if not my favorite video game of all time, it would be in the top three. And I have such wonderful memories of playing it back when it was released, and kind of sitting at the lunch table in high school, and was playing it, I say with a group of guys. We're sort of playing it at the same time, and kind of hearing what they did the night before, and where the story went. They were a little bit of ahead of me, and then as I discovered the game, it was just absolutely a tremendous experience. And I put out the video a couple of weeks ago talking about why I felt that the original Final Fantasy VII was such a magnificent game. So my prejudices and my fears have been assuaged a little bit with that demo, so I picked it up. Now, of course, we're going through the COVID-19 crisis. I'm working from home, and I have more time on my hands. So, I was able to devote more time to this game than I probably would do otherwise, and it was to a certain degree a comfort to have this game, and to have like I said, the kind of warm nostalgic feeling of sitting down and playing Final Fantasy again. So like I said, I want to really take some time to go through the game, go through my thoughts. This is just going to be a long discussion, and to a certain degree, I know these kind of long discussion videos aren't so popular, but all I have is time, and I have no one to talk about the game with, so I'm just going to go into it. So if you've been following the channel, you'll know that I can be kind of negative, and a lot of this is going to sound negative, but I just want to say here at the outset, I think the Final Fantasy VII Remake was a very successful game by modern AAA standards. I think it does a lot well, and kind of treats the first-person game experience with respect, and does justice to the idea of an immersive single-player game, which, is something that's going away. And so I respect and I appreciate that. And I'm going to get into all of these elements shortly, but, just at the outset, what it does well. The combat system, excellent. The graphics are among the best that I've seen on the PlayStation 4. The HDR effects in lighting are terrific. I think, with the various kind of difficulty settings, whether it's essentially the computer plays itself on easy and you just kind of input the commands, which they call the classic mode. The easy mode, which is, you control the whole system. But you get more, I think, friendly power-ups and different drops from the enemies, and nothing is too difficult to kind of the standard Final Fantasy. Well, I'm going to say standard Final Fantasy, but just the kind of regular, default control or default difficulty system, where not only do you have complete control over the characters, but, you really have to plan out your materia and kind of figure out the weaknesses of each character to really have a chance. So, from that standpoint, it's, I think, a very adaptable system, and you can get through the game as you like. Character models are very good. The story, the positive thing I'll say about the story is that, it is an example of, I would say, video game storytelling at the expected AAA level. So, I think if you pick this game up and you kind of come at it from the perspective of modern gaming, it is a very satisfying, very well done game. So none of the criticisms I'm going to go into should detract from that overall standard of quality that the game has. But as like I said, someone who has a fondness for the original game, somebody who grew up loving Final Fantasy VII, I do think that there are a lot of elements of this game that I'm not going to say are troubling or that are, a reason not to buy it, not to experience it, but, that nonetheless are somewhat disappointing for the old school fans of the game. And really my first disappointment was that from the perspective of the narrative, and also to a degree some of their artistic choices, this didn't really do anything to deepen the world that they created in Final Fantasy VII, which I thought, for really, I've played hundreds, thousands of video games, whatever it is, but I think the world of Final Fantasy VII was the most interesting. They took, and I talked about this in the previous video on Final Fantasy VII, they sort of took the kind of basic tenets of all the Final Fantasy games. They moved it to this, for the time anyway, futuristic setting. You have the classic tropes of the city under the plate and then the city over the plate, kind of a callback to Fritz Lang's Metropolis, and Blade Runner and things like that. I mean, not quite Blade Runner with the, cyborgs or whatever, but, it had that, classic Japanese 80s, 90s anime vibe, plus, this classic film idea of, the injustice of the city split by the plate, and, a lot of environmental themes going through it at a very superficial level, of course, in the original one. But, it is a world that I think a modern video game could have explored, certainly on the level of narrative. Of course, the story itself is obviously altered in a number of, I'm not going to say, it's going to be significant, if you're someone who wanted a straight remake, or just a straight retelling of everything that happened in the first game, there are enough changes to the story that you'll be upset if that's what you were looking forward to. I think the, narrative to me as it stands kind of makes some subtle changes where, someone who played the game 20-some years ago, you'll say, oh, wait a minute, that didn't happen there, or, oh, I don't remember this playing out this way. So they're not changing, I think, the overall story. Now, you'll say at the ending, yes, they are, and okay, that might be true. But to me, it felt, like I was still within the narrative framework set up by the original Final Fantasy. So I wasn't so, upset with that choice, but it was the side quests. It was the fact that there's so many different ways that you could have made Midgar feel alive, feel more complex, feel deeper in a narrative sense that they totally missed. And that has largely to do with the side quests. The side quests, to me, were your basic, everyday, 2020 AAA fetch quests. And there's really, no quest. And I probably missed one or two side quests because I eventually, and I'll go into this a little bit later, I started getting a little bit bored with the game as I was going through it. But, find the missing cats, find this item, bring it to this person. That does nothing to reveal what could be a very rich world. And I mean, look at the world that we live in today. You could have made a statement with the whole, environmental terrorist angle. Now, probably they don't want to go there, because they're just trying to sell as many games as possible. They don't want to be controversial. I get it. But you could have created side quests that took you to different areas of Midgard, that let you maybe see a side of an event in the first game that you might have missed. And okay, they do that to a degree with one of the reactor raids and kind of how you set up for that, and you kind of go to a character's house and see this different side of Midgard that you haven't seen before. But that was really one of the only instances where that came to play. You could have had any number of kind of interesting side quest characters that would take you down a different path and let you see a different part of Midgard that you didn't see before. So they didn't do that. The art style itself seems also to be torn, in a way, between incredible vistas and incredible locations and then sort of run-of-the-mill assets that kind of connect these moments together. And as a result, Midgard doesn't feel particularly special or interesting. So, you go into the slums, and if you remember the original game, and bear in mind, this is 20 years hindsight. I've played the Final Fantasy in stops and starts, between 97, 98, and 2020, but I haven't done a full playthrough, so, I may be recollecting this incorrectly, but nonetheless, I'm pretty sure that the original, Midgard had, dark blues and greens and sort of metals, and, there were these little bits that glowed. And so at night, the remake does that. But during the day, it's just kind of a gray-brown sort of wasteland. It looks like, a raid setting in a modern, Call of Duty game, in the desert somewhere. It doesn't look interesting. It looks kind of nondescript, and the roads that connect the different sectors of the slums are just, this constant, reuse of assets, running or walking from one place to another that just feels very samey. There's nothing interesting about it. And then you contrast that with other moments where, you're trying to knock out the power generators that create the artificial suns in the canopy of the steel sky, or you're going through Shinra headquarters, which is incredibly well done. Aerith's house, where there's such painstaking attention to detail and love, I felt, for the setting. And then you just contrast that with some very obvious kind of I don't know, just kind of laziness. Just, okay, we have, X amount of assets that we produced. Let's, collect them in this way or that way and connect these different moments. And as a result, I don't feel like I've learned anything new about the setting. I haven't explored the setting in any great detail. And that was what I really hoped for this game. I was like, well, you can take it in so many different directions, but regardless of what they do with the story, I want to get to know Midgar better, and that just didn't happen. And that same tension between brilliance and tedium, I think, actually extends into the gameplay itself. So the one thing I will say about this game, as somebody who wanted a traditional turn-based Final Fantasy combat system and who really hates these semi-active or active battle systems, the battle system here won me over. I think it is one of the best, if not the best, that I've played in a modern RPG. It captured the grandeur of a lot of these amazing boss battles that you had in the original, but obviously which were constrained significantly by the technology of the time, and now are at a level of just awe and beauty that I've really never seen. Now maybe that's been the case in some of the other Final Fantasy games that I haven't played. That could be, but I don't know. There was something almost inspiring to play some of these battles. And the system, even though the game runs at 30 frames per second, the system is felt snappy. It felt exciting. I loved how you can kind of switch between characters so rapidly, and have them do certain limit breaks and abilities and commands and summons, and you just kind of move fluidly from character to character. It just felt natural and enjoyable in a way that I didn't expect. And of course, it takes the system that we're familiar with from the old Final Fantasy, whether it's materia, limit breaks, summons, all the different items, materia combinations, and so it felt familiar in that sense, but it was much more enjoyable to play. To the extent that I wanted more battles. I mean, I kind of wanted a system where, okay, you may not have random battles, but I wanted actually grinding points where I could go and, use the battle system more and, earn money and kind of upgrade my weapons and my materia in a way that I wanted to. And really, the only way to do that is to play the optional side quests as a chance to get more experience, more gil, and more SP points for your weapons. So I didn't get to kind of use the system independently enough, which was a shame. But then, as you went into these extended sequences, whether again it was the power generators in the canopy, whether it was the second half of the Shinra building fights and things like that, the game felt unnecessarily tedious and extended at certain points, particularly the last couple of enemies, which were pains in the ass, and I don't know, it felt drawn out. It almost felt like, they wanted to pad some of the gameplay that they had, which is, I think, a shame. Like I said, the system is so good, the battle system is so good that to structure the gameplay around more freedom of choice for the player in, how they wanted to use the battles to improve their characters, I think that would have been preferable to the narrowly focused progression that the game gives you. And then, kind of a more broad point about the, narrow focus, I felt so much of the game, if I have one lasting image of the game, is that, it was so linear. And I made this point in the other video, and I said, well, I really hope that the remake isn't as linear. And I'm not just talking about, the linear progression of the story and the battles, but literally, so much of the game, the lasting impression for me is just walking. Walking from one point to the other in narrow corridors, whether they're on the ground, in the sky, whatever the case is. And I just felt when you've developed a battle system like this, it's a really missed opportunity to just kind of funnel the player in one direction. And I felt for much of the game, I was just, playing a walking simulator. I was just kind of, okay, go down this path, and it may branch here, it may branch there, but you're just kind of running forward without any variety. Yes, there are points where you have these almost semi-quick-time movement events. You see an icon, you press a button, and then maybe the traversal becomes, there's a different traversal animation, whether it's jumping, dodging, swinging, stuff like that, but you don't control it at that point. What you do only control is walking forward. So I talked about, the story itself, and while I didn't hate it, I didn't get that level of information I wanted about Midgar. I mean, I think as far as the characters go, the characterization, I will say, is strong. I mean, it I guess it depends on your personal taste. I think with Tifa and Aerith, they were going for and achieved a level of expressiveness in the characters that really brought them to life, but it kind of did so in a way, in what I perhaps mistakenly will call the Disney princess effect, where, they were, to me, and I haven't watched Disney movies in a long time, but, where they just had that, princess quality to them. Not in the damsel in distress sense, because I think the game, as most games do now, they try to, move away from the typical stereotypes of female characters. And look, I'm not saying that this is a great example of that, but, they're trying to anyway. But they had a kind of, I don't know, a kind of cuteness to them, an elegance that I think has always, to me, been the target of the Disney princess. And Barrett, to a degree, is what you would expect. And he might be the most successful character in the sense that here is a fully realized version of the Barrett that we had in Final Fantasy VII. The cloud and the, these reminiscence moments and the wisps or whatever they're called, which to me just seem to be an excuse to get particle effects into the game. That he is less successful. I think he's kind of a blank slate type character, and he's always been that way. But they're at a certain point they kind of descend into traditional anime tropes with the grunts to indicate angst or worry or agreement with something, particularly the female characters. I shouldn't say that. They have the grunts of assent, where they just, I'm not going to imitate it, but where they kind of go, and they like it. And then Cloud is always, any time something is mildly, mildly upsetting or embarrassing, he's just gasping. And it just gets irritating after a while. So I kind of think the story, in a way, is very simple, but it kind of has these moments that hint at a complexity that's not there. There are moments where it seems to be connected to other Final Fantasy VII lore. I won't say any more about that for those who still want to experience the game. I'm not sure how well that works. And, for the story going forward, I don't know, just nothing about the story says, oh my God, I can't wait to play that next installment. The treatment that they gave the story overall didn't do anything for me that the old story didn't. Now, just a couple of other items that I think are worth mentioning. The HDR lighting, I talked about this. This, in spots where it was used well, or I should say spots where it was used, I think it was perfectly suited to the type of world that Midgar was, this kind of, glowing disc world, infused with the, Mako, or I guess now we know it's called Mako energy. So there are just, even subtle things like the light reflecting off of Cloud's sword, or the sort of pulsating greens of the reactor. This was really, really, really well done. And like I said, when you contrast that with a lot of the bland reuse of assets in the game, I think that, and I wish that they could have used it more. Now it's probably very expensive to do that kind of lighting, but it was, along with the Ratchet and Clank remake, the most convincing application of this technology, where I can say, you know what, getting this TV and getting the PlayStation 4 Pro was worth it in this game. And I don't even have a particularly strong HDR television. I have one of the earlier models. I'm sure if you have like a 4K OLED, Dolby Vision HDR set, it would look even more incredible. So definitely a good idea there. I like that you could save anywhere in the game. Big improvement, and that should be a quality of life aspect of every modern RPG. I did appreciate the benches. That's where you can kind of restore your health and magic and stuff like that. And the vending machines. I mean, you may say that cheapens the game, makes it a little bit too easy, but in the end, as somebody who doesn't have the limitless amount of time that I did when I played the original one, that would have been particularly helpful in kind of like normal times when I'm going to work and I have stuff to do, and my game time is more limited than it is now. I thought that was particularly well done, and I will give them credit as far as the story goes, where they took sequences from the original game that were irritating, or at least that I remember to be irritating, and changed it in a way that made it less so. So, for example, when you rescue Aerith in the church from the Turks, you had that original thing where you would be in the ceiling and you'd have to figure out, which order to knock down the barrels, and here they moved it to, you're sort of chopping down chandeliers, and it made that sequence quicker, especially because I couldn't remember. It's like, I'm in the church. What was the order of the barrels again? And then if you remember the old game, if you did it the wrong way, you'd have to get into more fights and things like that. And they did that in a few other places that I felt really helped the game and helped the pacing. So, my overall impression of the Final Fantasy VII Remake, like I said, I've got a lot of criticism here. I have a lot of, I would say, as a fan of that original game and the expectations that I had personally, the game is a letdown. And I certainly felt, like I said, bored towards the end, particularly on those side quests. To the point where I was questioning, am I going to continue with this? Now, the game itself, for me, I think came in just under 40 hours, which I appreciate. I really can't do over 40. And like I said, I didn't do every quest, every side quest. There were definitely a couple that I just, out of boredom, skipped. But, as that time was ticking, I did feel in certain points like, I can't do this anymore. I just need to move on with my life. But then there were also moments where I felt legitimately happy to be playing, to think that 20-some years later I'm sitting here and I'm playing Final Fantasy VII, and I'm reconnecting, with those characters and with that environment, with that atmosphere that I really loved as a kid. So, it didn't do it for me on the level of a fan because the moments of nostalgic bliss were too interspersed with tedium. But at the same time, I can't criticize the game relative to other games today. I have very low tolerance for a lot of stuff that goes on in modern AAA games to the point where even if they're objectively good or objectively interesting to a degree, take, for example, the Spider-Man game on the PS4 that everyone loves, where I could say, oh, this was really, really well done. I can't commit 40 hours to it. I can't commit 50 hours to it. Yes, obviously, we're doing it in the time of coronavirus, so there is more time. And when you can't go out, you can't do anything. Okay, so I did have more time, but I probably would have finished Final Fantasy VII anyway. This is not exactly a short amount of time because I'm doing this review essentially a month later. But I felt that it did enough to be a really, really good AAA video game in 2020. My only caveat would also be, I was coming into it as, the best possible customer in the sense that I love the original, and perhaps my nostalgia was glossing over issues that would be worse for somebody who had no idea what Final Fantasy VII was about. I don't know that. I can't know that because of where I'm coming from. But I think that, young players who are just players who enjoy modern video games and other RPGs are not going to find faults with the game that will make them hate it. I think it's just overall a high-quality product. Now, will I play the other ones? Well, I don't even know if the other ones are coming out. It took this long to get this game. But, I would have to see. Again, in a sense, the nostalgia might drive me to it. I hope that they take more risks, take more chances in developing the story and doing other interesting things. For example, how Wutai is presented could be a kind of interesting storyline element that wasn't there in the first game. So, I think, I guess I'll end it by saying I'm cautiously optimistic about the future. I think this was, a game that I don't regret playing, even though I had a lot of problems with it as somebody who loved the original. So I can't say that I'm disappointed on a deep, visceral level. I guess I'll leave it by saying this. I appreciate the quality of what's there in the game, but I'm disappointed that that quality and that craftsmanship wasn't used to further explore the immensely interesting world that Final Fantasy VII is.